Hey guys, Megan here with Sticky Feet Reptiles. Today I decided to put together a presentation on crested geckos, morphs, and traits. I hope you enjoy it, and here we go. Some other common traits, one that's not really often mentioned anymore is called fringing. It's basically when the geckos have a white line of scales on the backs of their legs. It looks like a little fringe on their jeans or something. This was actually seen on the first geckos that were brought over to the US in the 90s, so it's definitely an interesting trait. Another trait we don't see often mentioned anymore is blushing, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to be pink-red coloration on the gecko's lower jaw, and that can happen in any morph as well. Portholes are white circles on a gecko's mid-lateral area. They often contain raised scales as well, and actually in the initial definition of portholes, that was part of the definition. I have seen geckos with portholes that don't necessarily have those raised scales. That'll come up later in conversation. Some people would consider those white spots, but I do define them differently. So generally, if a gecko has portholes, they're going to have more than one on any given side of the gecko. Pinstripe geckos are pretty common, pretty popular. Pinstripe gecko will have raised scales down either side of its dorsal. They're typically going to be lighter colored than the base color. So a cream or orange is going to be that pattern color. The color of the pins can continue the entire way down the back, which is going to be 100% pinstripe, or they can have breaks in the color. If it's not 100%, there's various terms to describe it, and that also varies as well. You may hear someone call it a high percentage pinstripe, dash pinstripe, partial pin, etc. They're just different ways of describing the fact that it has pinstriping, but it's not 100%. Reverse pinstripes are pretty cool. These geckos have a dark line of pattern on the upper laterals that runs along the outside of the dorsal scales. So it's not raised scales that we're looking at here in the photo. We're actually looking at that dark line underneath the dorsal scales. They can also have this line on the inside of the dorsal, in which case it would be called inner reverse pinstriping. Phantom pinstripes are also very interesting geckos. These geckos have raised scales along both sides of their dorsal like a normal pinstripe. However, in this case, the scales are going to be the same color as the dorsal, which is generally also the same color or a variation in the shade of the same color as the base of the gecko, if that makes sense. These scales can also be slightly highlighted on the tips with a lighter color, and it would still be considered a phantom pinstripe. The gecko here in this photo is actually a phantom pinstripe and a reverse pinstripe because it does, there again, have that dark line of coloration underneath the dorsal scales. Quad stripe is a gecko that has typically a full pinstripe, and it's also going to have a lateral stripe on both sides of the mid-lateral area. Typically, it'll run from the front legs to the back legs. Another trait is a solid dorsal. This is one of my favorite traits. I really love seeing a gecko with a solid cream dorsal. They are generally 100% pinstripes, and the dorsal contains little to no pattern because it is so filled in with color. White walls is a term to describe the line of white and cream pattern on a harlequin gecko. Typically extends along the mid-lateral area, and it gives a wall-like appearance, like that part of the gecko is blocked off. So the white spot trait is one of the more recent terms that has been thrown around, and a lot of people are confusing this trait with portholes because they're both basically white spots on the gecko. However, portholes, as I said before, generally are fairly small and usually will have a raised scale inside that white spot for portholes. So the white spot trait is can appear anywhere on the gecko, and they generally appear to be a lighter color than the rest of the pattern on the gecko. So even if you have a really creamy harlequin, the white spots will appear even lighter than the pattern and often look like a bleaching effect, almost like they're a bleach white color. Dripping dorsal is also a pretty fun fun trait. They appear to have drips of cream that extend downwards from their dorsal into the upper lateral area. This trait, along with several of the other traits, can develop and spread over time as the gecko grows. So this is one of the ones that's really fun to watch as the gecko develops. All right, so a little bit on structure as well. A gecko with good structure is generally more sought after than one with poor structure, and there are always exceptions to the rule. Structure is determined by the shape of the head, how wide it is, whether the gecko has good crests or none at all, and generally the length of the nose as well. Structure can develop over time, but only to a certain extent. If you have a baby that's completely bald, it's not going to turn into this amazing crowned animal over time. So bald geckos generally lack crests or have very few crests. This often is seen at the same time as narrow head structure, but not always. Some bald geckos actually are a result of improper housing or fighting and bullying, mistakes or accidents during the breeding season. So just because a gecko doesn't actually have crests doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have poor head structure as well, but occasionally it does occur at the same time. Geckos with a narrow or reverted head, they traditional definition of that was that the total head length is greater than 1.3 times the width of the head. So geckos that generally have pretty decent structure, they're not bald, they don't have a narrow head, and on the same side of this coin, they're not crowned. A lot of times they're just kind of looked over because there isn't anything spectacular about this structure, whether for the good or for the bad. It does take some practice to be able to see the difference in structure in crested geckos, and a lot of it is just really looking and watching as they grow to be able to really pick out the geckos that might develop into really nice structured geckos and those that will probably not. Here's some photos I put together of geckos that all have decent structure. None of them are really narrow-headed. None of them are bald. They all have fairly nice sized heads. And then crowned is a term that's used to define structure in geckos that has a very, very large head. And the traditional definition of this was that a gecko has a head length less than 1.3 times the width of the head. I don't really go by the mathematical route here, and I don't sit there and measure the heads of my geckos, but you can tell just by looking once you have some experience. The gecko will have a more kite-like appearance to its head, and sometimes the head is so large the sides actually begin to droop down due to the size. Now, crown does not indicate the size of the crests themselves, but often does go hand in hand. So a lot of times you will see a gecko that is crowned that also has very nice long crests, but that's not always the case. So another structural trait, a lot of people will call this furred or hairy. This is seen when a gecko has exaggerated crests and scales that continue from the head slightly down the dorsal. And it can go all the way down the scales down the dorsal or just a little ways down the neck area. But as you can see in this photo here, the gecko has those exaggerated crests along the neck area. So there are some misconceptions, obviously, when it comes to morphs and traits in geckos. Probably one of the biggest myths is the moonglow gecko. This was just a name that was manufactured at some point in time to go along with a high price tag, basically. They're touted as being really white and pale geckos that always stay that way. I personally have never seen a moonglow gecko because generally what happens is these animals fire up to be a buckskin color, a yellow, or even a red. But this is part of the reason why when we're determining the morph of the gecko, you want to make sure that it's fired up before you describe it. Albino crested geckos. So to date, there has not been a known proven case of an albino crested gecko. There just have not been any that have been discovered. There have been crested gecko hatchlings that looked like amels, but as far as we're aware, none of these have survived long after hatching. Color and pigment is typically one of the last things to develop in the egg. So a gecko that hatches out too early or had developmental delays, it might look like an AML but or an albino, but it's probably not truly a genetic mutation. It's most likely just a result of lack of proper development and incubation in the egg. One of the really cool cases of a different looking gecko is the piebald crested gecko. There's only one known living piebald crested gecko. This mutation has not been reproduced to date, and it obviously is owned by Matt Parks of Pangea Reptile, which the photo was and does belong to him. But it's just a really neat idea to see animals like that. And in this case, we don't know if it's genetically reproducible or not. Recent development, which there's a typo, I do apologize, in crested gecko genetics is currently being researched at Altitude Exotics and Brian Butler. These geckos are actually gray, lacking red and yellow pigment, and they have gray eyes and even gray tongues. So it's really a cool thing that's going on over there. We're really excited to see what comes of that project. So to finish up here, crested gecko morphs and traits are constantly being improved upon. The definitions are always expanded with new traits refined, ones are discovered and added on, and even more extreme versions of morphs being produced. We should be aware, however, and that's part of the reason why I created this presentation, of the basic building blocks upon which the species has been defined, and we should use these standard definitions as we continue forward to really help educate newcomers and to allow for more ease in describing our animals. If we have this standard definition and these standard building blocks to work on, it makes it a lot easier to go from there and build upon that to discover new traits and new morphs that we're producing every day. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or check me out on my Facebook page and shoot me a message there. Thanks very much, guys. Have a good one.